December 7th, 1941. 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time. Seaman Second Class. James Ward was carrying a pot of coffee across the deck of the USS Arizona when he heard it. A sound like tearing fabric, growing louder, closer, impossible to place. He looked up and saw something that made no sense. A silver aircraft with red circles on its wings diving toward Battleship Row. For a split second, Ward thought it was a drill, an unusually realistic drill. Then the first bomb fell, and the world exploded. What happened in the next 110 minutes would kill 2,403 Americans, destroy or damage 21 ships, eliminate 188 aircraft, and drag the United States into the largest war in human history. But the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't a sudden surprise. It was the culmination of months of planning, years of tension, and decades of rivalry. The destruction that Sunday morning represented one of the most precisely executed military operations ever attempted, and one of the greatest intelligence failures in American history. This story isn't just about what happened. It's about how it happened, minute by minute, bomb by bomb, decision by decision. From the Japanese carriers 230 miles north of Oahu to the burning decks of Battleship Row, from the pilots who thought they were invincible to the sailors who died without knowing they were at war. Before we begin this minute-by-minute breakdown, tell us where you're watching from. We're building a community of history enthusiasts who understand that the past isn't just dates and facts. It's human stories of courage, failure, and consequence. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, began like any other peacetime Sunday at Pearl Harbor. The Hawaiian sun rose at 6:26 a.m. over a harbor filled with the pride of the American Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships, the core of American naval power, were moored along the southeast shore of Ford Island in what the Navy called Battleship Row. The USS Arizona, USS Tennessee, USS West Virginia, USS Maryland, USS Oklahoma, USS Nevada, USS California, and USS Pennsylvania, the latter in dry dock, represented generations of American naval construction and the assumption of Pacific dominance. Most of the crews were ashore on liberty or sleeping late. Sunday was a day of rest, and Saturday night had been long. Honolulu's bars and dance halls had been filled with sailors and soldiers enjoying what they thought was peacetime. Some were still stumbling back to their ships as dawn broke. Others would never make it back. In the harbor itself, everything was arranged for efficiency, not defense. The battleships were moored in pairs to save space. The aircraft at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, though this made them perfect targets for an air attack. Anti-aircraft ammunition was locked away, requiring officer authorization to access. The thinking was clear. Japan might attack the Philippines or British territories in Southeast Asia, but Pearl Harbor, deep in the Central Pacific, was untouchable. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was one of the few officers on duty at Ford Island's command center that morning. Later, he would remember the weather: perfect visibility, scattered clouds at 2,000 feet, winds light from the northeast, flying weather, attack weather. But no one expected an attack. At 6:00 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward, patrolling the entrance to Pearl Harbor, detected something unusual on sonar. A submarine periscope was spotted trying to follow the cargo ship Antares into the harbor. The Ward's captain, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, made a decision that would later be recognized as the war's first American offensive action. He ordered his ship to attack. At 6:45 a.m., the Ward fired on and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to penetrate the harbor defenses. Outerbridge immediately radioed his report. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." The message reached headquarters at 7:40 a.m. Officers debated its meaning. Submarine contacts were common, usually false alarms. Should they sound a general alert based on one destroyer's report? They decided to wait for confirmation. That 8-minute delay in decision-making would cost thousands of lives. Meanwhile, 230 miles north of Oahu, the Japanese strike force was already launching its attack. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The carrier striking force, Kido Butai, had sailed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuriil Islands on November 26th, taking a northern route across the Pacific specifically chosen to avoid commercial shipping lanes and detection. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was audacious. Strike Pearl Harbor at dawn on a Sunday, when defenses would be minimal, destroy the American Pacific Fleet's battleships, and eliminate American air power in the Pacific. This would buy Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate its control over Southeast Asia's resource-rich territories, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Yamamoto believed Japan couldn't win a prolonged war against American industrial might, but a devastating opening blow might convince the United States to negotiate peace rather than fight. The attack force carried 353 aircraft, 40 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers armed with specially modified aerial torpedoes, 49 B-5N high-level bombers carrying 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells, 51 Aichi D-3A dive bombers with 250-kilogram bombs, and 43 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. A second wave of 167 aircraft would follow. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, a veteran pilot and one of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, commanded the airstrike. At 6:00 a.m., as the ward was attacking the midget submarine, Fuchida was in the ready room aboard the Akagi receiving final intelligence updates. American carriers were reported to be at sea, not in harbor. This was disappointing. Carriers represented modern naval power, and their absence meant the attack would miss its most valuable targets. But the battleships would still be there, symbols of American naval might. At 6:15 a.m., the first aircraft began launching from the carriers. The sea was rough, with 12-foot swells that made the flight decks rise and fall dramatically. Launching aircraft in these conditions was dangerous, but Japanese pilots were superbly trained. Within 15 minutes, 183 aircraft were airborne, forming up in the pre-dawn darkness before turning south toward Oahu. At 7:02 a.m., the Opana Point radar station on Oahu's northern coast detected the incoming formation. Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott, manning the experimental radar equipment, saw a massive return on their screen, unlike anything they'd seen before. Lockard calculated over 50 aircraft approaching from the north, 132 miles out. They immediately called the information center at Fort Shafter. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the only officer on duty at the information center that early Sunday morning, received the report. Tyler knew that a flight of B-17 bombers was expected from the mainland that morning. He made what seemed like a reasonable assumption. The radar had detected the friendly B-17s. "Don't worry about it," he told Lockard. The radar operators continued tracking the formation until it disappeared into ground clutter at 7:39 a.m., just 20 miles from Oahu. At 7:40 a.m., Commander Fuchida, leading the attack formation at 9,000 feet, broke through the clouds and saw Oahu spread below him. The harbor was exactly where it should be. Through his binoculars, he could see the distinctive shapes of battleships moored along Ford Island. No combat air patrol was visible. No anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them. The Americans were completely unprepared. Fuchida ordered his radio man to transmit the attack signal, "To, to, to," the first syllable of Totsugeki, meaning charge. Then, seeing no defensive reaction from below, he transmitted the code indicating complete surprise had been achieved. "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." In Tokyo, it was 3:19 a.m. Monday, December 8th. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Nagato at Hashirajima Anchorage, received Fuchida's message. Complete surprise achieved. The attack was proceeding exactly as planned, but Yamamoto's expression remained grim. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and understood American industrial capacity. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he would later write. Though whether he said this immediately upon hearing of the attack's success remains debated by historians. The first bomb fell at exactly 7:48 a.m. A dive bomber from the Soryu released its 250-kilogram bomb over the seaplane ramp on Ford Island. The explosion sent shrapnel and coral fragments spraying across the island. Sailors walking to morning muster looked up in confusion. Some still thought it was a drill, an unusually realistic exercise. That illusion lasted approximately 5 seconds. The torpedo bombers came in low and fast, skimming 50 feet above the water. The Japanese had solved a problem that had seemed insurmountable. Pearl Harbor averaged only 40 feet deep, too shallow for conventional aerial torpedoes, which dove to 100 feet or more after release before leveling off. Japanese engineers had modified their Type 91 torpedoes with wooden fins and special release mechanisms that allowed them to run in shallow water. They had practiced the technique at Kagoshima Bay, which approximated Pearl Harbor's depth and geography. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led 40 torpedo bombers in a coordinated strike on Battleship Row. The attack was textbook perfect, splitting into 2 groups to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Americans would have only seconds to react, and most of their anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. At 7:50 a.m., the USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, was struck by the first torpedo. Seaman Stephen Young, below decks, felt the ship shudder. The lights flickered and died. Then came a second impact, and a third. Within minutes, 5 torpedoes had ripped into the Oklahoma's port side. The massive battleship, displacing 29,000 tons, began listing immediately. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Jesse Kenworthy, Jr. realized instantly what was happening. The ship was going to capsize. He ordered abandon ship, but the announcement system was already dead. Men trapped below decks never received the order. As water poured through the torpedo holes, the Oklahoma rolled onto its side like a dying whale. The entire evolution from first torpedo hit to complete capsizing took 12 minutes. 429 men died aboard the Oklahoma. Many were trapped in compartments that became air pockets as the ship turned turtle. For days after the attack, rescue crews could hear them pounding on the hull from inside, desperately tapping out messages. 32 men were eventually cut free from the overturned hull. The rest drowned as their air ran out or the rising harbor water claimed them. Simultaneously, the USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the USS Tennessee, absorbed 7 torpedo hits in less than 3 minutes. Damage control parties struggled to respond, but the ship's systems were failing. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding from the bridge, was mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb explosion on the nearby Tennessee. As he lay dying, he continued giving orders, trying to save his ship and crew. Ensign Victor Delano, the ship's damage control officer, made a split-second decision that would save hundreds of lives. He ordered immediate counterflooding on the starboard side, deliberately filling compartments to keep the ship upright. The West Virginia settled evenly onto the harbor bottom, rather than capsizing like the Oklahoma. This meant most of the crew could escape. 105 men died aboard the West Virginia, a tragedy, but far fewer than would have perished if she'd rolled over. At 7:55 a.m., high-level bombers struck the USS Arizona. The battleship, moored inboard next to the repair ship USS Vestal, had survived the torpedo attack because she was protected by the Vestal on her port side. But armor-piercing bombs, unlike torpedoes, struck from above. The Japanese had converted 16-inch naval artillery shells into aerial bombs by adding fins and special fuses. These 1,760-pound projectiles could penetrate the Arizona's 13-inch deck armor, something conventional bombs couldn't achieve. At 8:06 a.m., one of these modified shells struck the Arizona near Turret 2, penetrated the forward magazine, and detonated nearly 1 million pounds of gunpowder stored there. The explosion was cataclysmic. Witnesses described a fireball rising 500 feet into the air, followed by a shock wave that shattered windows miles away. The Arizona's forward structure, everything forward of the mainmast, was simply obliterated. The blast wave threw men from other ships into the water. The concussion knocked aircraft from the sky. Seaman Russell Lott, aboard the neighboring Vestal, watched the Arizona's bow lift out of the water, shattered and burning. "She jumped at least 15 or 20 feet upward in the water," he later testified, "broke in two and commenced to sink. The flames were coming through the boat deck and compartments were exploding." 1,177 men died aboard the Arizona in that single moment. Some were vaporized by the explosion. Others drowned as the ship settled rapidly into the mud. Still more burned to death in the fuel oil fires that spread across the water. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, both killed on the bridge by the initial explosion. Neither body was ever recovered. The Arizona sank in less than 9 minutes, settling upright in 40 feet of water with her superstructure still visible above the surface. Fuel oil from her ruptured tanks spread across the harbor, igniting in sheets of flame that would burn for 2.5 days. By 8 a.m., 12 minutes into the attack, Battleship Row was a vision of hell. The Oklahoma had capsized. The Arizona was a burning tomb. The West Virginia was settling into the mud. The California, moored alone at the southern end of Battleship Row, had taken 2 torpedo hits and was slowly flooding, her crew fighting desperately to save her. But not all the battleships were helpless. The USS Nevada, moored alone astern of the Arizona, was the only battleship to get underway during the attack. Chief Boatswain Edwin Hill had been ashore when the attack began. Seeing what was happening, he swam back to his ship, climbed aboard soaking wet, and immediately began supervising the preparation to get underway. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the senior officer aboard, Nevada being the only battleship whose captain and executive officer were both ashore, made the decision to sortie. If they could get the ship out of the harbor, they could maneuver, fight back, and avoid being trapped if burning oil spread to their position. At 8:12 a.m., the Nevada backed away from her mooring and began moving down the channel toward the harbor entrance. Sailors on other ships cheered as they saw the battleship moving under her own power, battle ensign flying, guns firing at attacking aircraft. For a moment, it seemed like a successful escape was possible. But Commander Fuchida, orbiting overhead and coordinating the attack, immediately recognized the danger and the opportunity. If the Nevada could be sunk in the harbor channel, she would block the entrance, trapping every other ship inside. He ordered every available bomber to concentrate on the moving battleship. Wave after wave of dive bombers screamed down on the Nevada as she fought her way toward the harbor mouth. Bombs exploded on her decks, tore through her superstructure, and started fires throughout the ship. The forward decks became an inferno, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. Admiral William Furlong, aboard the mine-layer USS Oglala, watching the Nevada's attempted escape, realized the same thing Fuchida had. If she sank in the channel, the disaster would be compounded. He ordered the Nevada to beach herself rather than risk blocking the entrance. At 8:35 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Thomas, his ship ablaze and taking on water, deliberately ran the Nevada aground at Hospital Point. The battleship's bow crunched into the mud, and she settled at an angle, still burning but no longer a threat to the harbor entrance. 50 men had died aboard the Nevada, but her crew's courage and quick thinking had prevented an even greater catastrophe. While the battleships bore the brunt of the attack, the entire harbor was under assault. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, Japanese dive bombers destroyed the neat rows of parked aircraft. B-17s, A-20s, and other bombers, aligned wingtip to wingtip, were strafed and bombed where they sat. Fuel trucks exploded, hangars collapsed, and the base's barracks took direct hits. Technical Sergeant Stanley McLeod was in the barracks at Hickam when the first bombs fell. The building shook violently. Chunks of concrete, glass, and bed springs showered into the room. Someone yelled, "Earthquake!" Then we heard the planes and the machine gun fire. We knew. Men ran outside in various states of undress, some still in pajamas, trying to reach defensive positions. Many were cut down by strafing Zeros before they made it 50 feet. At Wheeler Field, the Army Air Corps fighter base in central Oahu, the story was the same. P-40 Warhawk fighters, parked in neat rows, were destroyed on the ground. A few pilots reached their aircraft and attempted to take off under fire. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to get airborne from Halewa, an auxiliary field that the Japanese had somehow missed. They would shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft between them, becoming the attack's first American heroes. But these were exceptions. Of 231 Army aircraft on Oahu, 188 were destroyed or damaged. The Navy lost 92 aircraft. Japanese losses in the first wave were minimal: 3 fighters, 1 dive bomber, and 5 torpedo bombers, 9 aircraft out of 183. At 8:25 a.m., as fires raged across Pearl Harbor and sailors fought desperately to save their ships, the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived. Led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, this wave consisted of 167 aircraft, 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 35 fighters. Their mission was to finish what the first wave had started, destroying any ships that remained operational and eliminating shore installations. But the second wave faced a very different situation than the first. The Americans were no longer surprised. Anti-aircraft guns, silent during the first wave's opening minutes, were now fully manned and firing. Ammunition that had been locked away was now being expended with desperate enthusiasm. Every gun that could be brought to bear was shooting. The Americans were learning that volume of fire mattered more than accuracy. Sailors with rifles and pistols fired at aircraft 5,000 feet overhead, achieving nothing except keeping morale up. Machine guns designed for surface targets were pressed into anti-aircraft service. The sky filled with tracer fire, creating a visual deterrent even when the rounds missed. The second wave concentrated on ships that had escaped serious damage in the first attack. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was in dry dock and had been spared torpedo damage. Now dive bombers attacked her, scoring 1 direct hit that killed 15 men and caused moderate damage. The destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs, sharing the same dry dock, weren't as fortunate. Multiple bomb hits set both ships ablaze. The fires reached their fuel tanks and torpedo storage, causing massive explosions that lifted the destroyers off their blocks. The Cassin rolled against the Downs, and both ships became twisted metal sculptures, effectively destroyed though later salvaged for parts. At the Navy Yard, the destroyer USS Shaw, in a floating dry dock, took 3 bomb hits that detonated her forward magazine. The explosion, captured in one of the war's most iconic photographs, sent a fireball hundreds of feet into the air and completely destroyed the ship's bow. Miraculously, the Shaw would later be given a temporary bow and sailed back to the West Coast for rebuilding. The second wave also concentrated on ships attempting to get underway. The light cruiser USS Helena and the mine layer USS Oglala, moored together, were attacked by torpedo bombers. A torpedo aimed at the Helena passed under the Oglala and struck the cruiser, but the shock wave ruptured the Oglala's plates. The old mine layer began flooding and eventually capsized, though her crew escaped with minimal casualties. But the second wave paid a higher price than the first. American anti-aircraft fire had improved dramatically. Ships coordinated their fire, creating barrage zones that aircraft had to fly through. The Japanese lost 20 aircraft in the second wave, more than double the first wave's losses. Individual acts of heroism multiplied as the attack continued. Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the West Virginia, manned a .50 caliber machine gun despite having no training on the weapon. As one of the first African-American sailors to receive the Navy Cross, Miller's actions challenged the racist assumptions that had relegated black sailors to mess duty. "It wasn't hard," he later said with characteristic modesty. "I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine." At the submarine base, Captain John Earl organized firefighting efforts that saved multiple vessels. At Hospital Point, medical personnel worked under fire to treat casualties. At Ford Island, ground crews attempted to prepare aircraft for launch, even as bombs fell around them. At approximately 9 a.m., the last Japanese aircraft turned north and headed back to their carriers. The attack had lasted just over 110 minutes, but Pearl Harbor would burn for days. As the sound of aircraft engines faded and the anti-aircraft guns fell silent, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. Of the 8 battleships present, 4 had been sunk: the Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and California. The Nevada was beached and severely damaged. The Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had suffered varying degrees of damage, but remained afloat and repairable. The Arizona would never sail again. The Oklahoma would be raised but never return to service. Beyond the battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary vessels had been sunk or damaged. The material losses were staggering, but the human cost was worse. 2,335 sailors and soldiers had been killed. 1,143 were wounded. The Arizona alone accounted for nearly half the total deaths. The attack had been an operational masterpiece. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, concentrated overwhelming force at the decisive point, and executed with precision. Their losses, 29 aircraft and 55 airmen killed, plus 5 midget submarines and 9 submariners, were negligible compared to the destruction inflicted. But strategically, the attack contained the seeds of Japan's ultimate defeat. The 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea and escaped damage. These carriers would form the core of the American counterattack in the coming months. The oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of fuel oil, had not been targeted and remained intact. Destroying these tanks would have forced the Pacific Fleet to withdraw to the west coast. The Navy Yard facilities, including the crucial dry docks and machine shops, had suffered only moderate damage and would soon be operating at full capacity, repairing damaged ships. Most significantly, the attack unified American public opinion in a way nothing else could have. Before December 7th, America was deeply divided about involvement in the war. Isolationism was a powerful political force. After December 7th, those debates ended. The attack on Pearl Harbor, particularly coming while Japanese diplomats in Washington were supposedly negotiating peace, was seen as treachery. A date which will live in infamy, President Franklin Roosevelt would tell Congress the next day. The afternoon of December 7th brought new terrors. With Japanese carriers somewhere north of Oahu and their exact location unknown, invasion seemed imminent. Rumors spread wildly. Japanese paratroopers had landed on the North Shore, saboteurs were poisoning water supplies, Japanese residents were signaling to aircraft with lights and mirrors. None of these rumors were true, but in the chaos, they seemed plausible. Military authorities declared martial law. Armed soldiers patrolled the streets. Anyone who looked Japanese, citizen or not, fell under immediate suspicion. This paranoia would eventually lead to the internment of Japanese Americans, one of the darkest chapters in American history. The military response that afternoon was hampered by continued confusion. When American aircraft returning from patrol attempted to land that evening, trigger-happy anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, shooting down several friendly planes. The USS Enterprise, returning to Pearl Harbor, launched aircraft to scout ahead. These planes were engaged by panicked American gunners. 4 were shot down, killing 3 pilots. At Pearl Harbor itself, the afternoon was consumed by rescue and recovery operations. Sailors worked frantically to cut holes in the overturned Oklahoma, trying to reach men trapped inside. The tapping on the hull provided desperate encouragement. Each man rescued was a small victory against the overwhelming tragedy. On the Arizona, fires prevented immediate rescue attempts. The ship would burn for 2.5 days, the oil slick around her catching fire repeatedly. Bodies floated in the harbor or lay burned beyond recognition on decks too hot to approach. The smell of burning flesh and oil would hang over Pearl Harbor for weeks. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. The base hospital had prepared for perhaps 50 casualties in a training exercise. Instead, over 1,000 wounded poured in within hours. Doctors and nurses worked 48-hour shifts without rest, performing emergency surgery in corridors and outdoor spaces. Blood supplies ran out. Medical personnel donated their own blood while still operating. The base chapel became a temporary morgue. Bodies were laid in rows, identified when possible, covered with sheets. Many would never be identified. The Arizona's dead, entombed in their ship, would remain there permanently. The battleship would eventually become a memorial, a shrine to those who died in the attack. While Pearl Harbor burned, Vice Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision aboard the Akagi. His strike force had achieved complete tactical success. American battleships were sunk or damaged. Air power was destroyed. The base was in chaos. His own losses had been minimal, less than 10% of the attacking force. Commander Fuchida and other air group commanders urged a third wave. The targets were obvious and crucial: the oil storage tanks, the submarine base, the ship repair facilities. Destroying these would cripple Pearl Harbor for months, perhaps years. American carriers were still at sea somewhere, and finding and sinking them would complete the victory. But Nagumo refused. His orders had been to attack Pearl Harbor and then withdraw. Those orders had been accomplished. Launching a third wave meant remaining in Hawaiian waters for hours more, increasing the risk of American counterattack. Nagumo had no idea where the American carriers were. They could be anywhere. Remaining in the area to launch and recover aircraft meant his own carriers were vulnerable. At 1:30 p.m., Nagumo ordered the strike force to withdraw to the northwest. The carriers turned away from Oahu, increasing speed, eager to put distance between themselves and any American response. The decision remains controversial to this day. Many historians believe a third wave would have destroyed Pearl Harbor's ability to function as a forward base, forcing the Pacific Fleet back to California and delaying American offensive operations by months. But Nagumo's caution was understandable. He had achieved his primary mission with minimal losses. Pressing his luck invited disaster. The attack on Pearl Harbor had worked because of surprise. That surprise was gone. Extended operations in enemy waters, with American carriers of unknown location potentially hunting him, seemed foolishly risky. The American carriers had missed the attack through a combination of luck and routine operations. The USS Enterprise, under Vice Admiral William Halsey, had been delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island and was returning to Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7th, she was about 200 miles west of Oahu. When news of the attack reached Halsey, his response was immediate and visceral. "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." The Enterprise launched search aircraft looking for the Japanese carriers. None found them. Nagumo's strike force had approached from the north, an unexpected direction, and had already withdrawn beyond search range. The failure to find and engage the Japanese carriers would frustrate Halsey for months. The USS Lexington, under Rear Admiral John Newton, had been on a mission to deliver aircraft to Midway Island. She was 420 miles southeast of Midway when the attack occurred, too far away to intervene. Like the Enterprise, the Lexington immediately launched searches, but found nothing. The USS Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing maintenance and missed the entire attack. This stroke of luck meant the Pacific Fleet retained 3 fleet carriers, the minimum force needed to eventually turn the tide in the Pacific. President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, December 8th. His speech, lasting just over 6 minutes, was broadcast nationwide by radio. Americans listened in homes, offices, and factories as their president declared war. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation and, at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The speech was brief, direct, and devastating in its simplicity. Roosevelt detailed the attacks not just on Pearl Harbor, but on Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong. The scope of Japanese aggression was clear. This was not a limited strike, but the opening of a general Pacific War. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounded determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. Congress voted for war with only one dissenting vote. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a lifelong pacifist who had also voted against American entry into World War I, cast the sole no vote. Within days, Germany and Italy, honoring their tripartite pact with Japan, would declare war on the United States. America was now fully committed to World War II. In the days and weeks following the attack, Pearl Harbor became the site of the most extensive salvage operation in naval history. The job seemed impossible. Massive battleships lay on the harbor bottom or capsized on the surface. Oil fires still burned. Bodies remained trapped in compartments, but the Navy was determined to recover everything possible. The salvage of the USS Oklahoma was particularly challenging. The 29,000-ton battleship lay capsized in 40 feet of water, her hull exposed to the air. The first priority was recovering survivors, then bodies. Rescue crews cut through the hull with pneumatic drills and acetylene torches, working around the clock. 32 men were pulled from the overturned hull alive. 429 bodies were eventually recovered, though some compartments remained sealed, becoming tombs. After body recovery, the salvage team faced the challenge of righting the ship. They couldn't simply refloat a capsized battleship. Instead, they attached 21 massive winches to the hull, running cables to anchors on Ford Island. Over 5 months, they slowly rotated the Oklahoma upright. The operation required calculating weight distribution, maintaining balance, and coordinating 21 different pulling forces simultaneously. It was an engineering marvel. By March 1943, the Oklahoma was refloated, but the damage was too extensive for economical repair. The ship was decommissioned and eventually sold for scrap. While being towed to San Francisco in 1947, the Oklahoma sank in a storm 500 miles from Hawaii, as if returning to her final resting place. The West Virginia, California, and Nevada were all refloated, repaired, and returned to service. The West Virginia, sunken harbor, would be raised by December 1943 and modernized. She would participate in the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the bombardment of Okinawa, getting revenge for Pearl Harbor by helping sink Japanese battleships. The Nevada, beached at Hospital Point, was refloated in February 1942 and sent to Puget Sound for repairs. She would support the Normandy invasion in 1944 and the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, becoming one of the war's most decorated battleships. Only the Arizona remained untouched. The fires finally burned out after 3 days, but the ship was declared a total loss. 1,177 men remained entombed in her hull. Over the years, a memorial would be built above the sunken battleship, honoring all those who died at Pearl Harbor. Behind the statistics were thousands of individual stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy. Some would become famous, like Doris Miller's heroism. Others remained known only to families and shipmates. Ensign Joe Tausig, aboard the USS Nevada, took command of the forward anti-aircraft battery during the attack. Both his legs were shattered by shrapnel, but he refused evacuation, remaining at his post and directing fire for hours. When finally carried below for medical treatment, his legs were so badly damaged that amputation seemed certain. He survived, kept his legs after extensive surgery, and later commanded a destroyer in the Pacific, proving his determination. Private First Class James Mann, a Marine guard at Iwa Mooring Mast Field, manned a machine gun during the attack despite being mortally wounded. He continued firing until he collapsed and died at his gun. His dedication earned him a posthumous Navy Cross and eternal respect from fellow Marines. Chief Water Tender Peter Tomich, aboard the USS Utah, a demilitarized target ship that capsized during the attack, remained at his post in the engineering spaces to ensure boilers were properly secured, allowing many men to escape. He was still there when the ship rolled over, sacrificing his life to save his crew. He received a posthumous Medal of Honor. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, both killed aboard the Arizona, received posthumous Medals of Honor. Rear Admiral Kidd became the first American flag officer killed in World War II. His body was never recovered from the Arizona's wreckage. The youngest victim was 16-year-old Calvin Graham, who had lied about his age to enlist. He survived Pearl Harbor, but would later be wounded at Guadalcanal before the Navy discovered his real age and discharged him. The oldest was 62-year-old Chief Water Tender Robert Scott, who had postponed retirement to continue serving his country. Brothers died together that day. The 5 Sullivan brothers wouldn't die until a year later aboard the USS Juneau, but Pearl Harbor claimed 37 sets of brothers. The Borgerson brothers, Kenneth and Gordon, both died aboard the Arizona. The Free brothers, Thomas and William, died on the Oklahoma. These losses devastated families back home and led to the eventual sole survivor policy, preventing all siblings from serving together in combat zones. Some survivors carried physical and psychological scars forever. Seaman First Class Mai Evans, pulled from the burning water around the Arizona, spent 18 months in hospitals recovering from severe burns. He would never speak of that morning to his children, the memories too painful to share. Thousands more carried similar burdens silently. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded not just because of Japanese planning, but because of comprehensive American intelligence failures. In retrospect, the warning signs were everywhere. Understanding these failures would reshape American intelligence gathering for generations. Throughout 1941, tensions between the United States and Japan escalated dramatically. The American oil embargo, imposed in response to Japanese expansion in China and Indochina, threatened Japan's war-making capacity. Japanese forces needed oil, and the Dutch East Indies had it. But seizing those territories meant war with Britain, the Netherlands, and likely America. American cryptographers had broken Japanese diplomatic codes, giving them access to communications between Tokyo and Japanese diplomats worldwide. These intercepts, codenamed Magic, provided crucial intelligence about Japanese intentions, but diplomatic traffic and military communications were different things. The Japanese Navy's codes remained secure. In November 1941, Magic intercepts revealed that Japanese diplomats in Washington had been instructed to destroy their code machines and burn sensitive documents. This was clearly a prelude to war. But where would Japan strike? The Philippines seemed most likely. British Malaya was probable. Pearl Harbor seemed impossibly distant. On November 27th, the Navy Department sent a war warning to Pacific commands. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. Negotiations with Japan looking toward stabilization of conditions in the Pacific have ceased, and an aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, commanding Army forces in Hawaii, received this warning. But the message was ambiguous about targets and timing. Both commanders took defensive measures focused on sabotage, not air attack. Aircraft were bunched together to guard them better. Anti-aircraft ammunition remained secured to prevent accidents. The focus was on protecting against internal threats from Hawaii's large Japanese-American population. The war warning specifically mentioned the Philippines, Thailand, the Kra Peninsula, and Borneo as possible targets. Pearl Harbor wasn't listed. The assumption was clear. Japan would attack American territories in the Western Pacific or British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia. Hawaii was too far from Japan to be a realistic target, but Japanese carriers had been missing from intelligence reports for weeks. The U.S. Navy had lost track of the Kido Butai. Some intelligence officers assumed the carriers were in home waters training. Others thought they might be supporting operations in Southeast Asia. No one seriously considered they might be steaming across the North Pacific toward Hawaii. The radar contact at 7:02 a.m. should have provided final warning. A formation of 50-plus aircraft approaching from an unexpected direction should have triggered an immediate alert. But Lieutenant Tyler's assumption about friendly B-17s seemed reasonable at the moment. In retrospect, it was catastrophic. The destroyer ward's submarine contact at 6:45 a.m. also should have raised alarms. A submarine trying to penetrate Pearl Harbor was clearly hostile, but the report took precious time to reach decision-makers, and when it did, they hesitated. Past submarine contacts had been false alarms. Should they sound a general alert that might prove embarrassing if this too was a false contact? These intelligence failures led to massive reforms. After Pearl Harbor, the Army and Navy created unified command structures in each theater. Intelligence from all sources was centralized and analyzed collectively. The assumption that America's geographic isolation provided security was abandoned. The idea that enemies would provide convenient warnings before attacking was recognized as dangerously naive. Admiral Kimmel and General Short both were relieved of command within days of the attack. For the rest of their lives, they argued they had been scapegoated, that Washington had failed to provide them adequate intelligence, that the warnings sent had been too vague to act upon decisively. Multiple investigations over the decades have debated responsibility, finding fault at multiple levels from Hawaii to Washington. The truth seems to be that responsibility was shared. Washington provided warnings, but not specific intelligence about timing or targets. Kimmel and Short received warnings but focused on the wrong threats. The entire American command structure assumed Hawaii was too far away to attack and that Japan wouldn't risk war with the United States. All these assumptions proved fatally wrong. For Japan, Pearl Harbor appeared to be an overwhelming victory. The American Pacific Fleet's battle line was destroyed. Air power in Hawaii was eliminated. The Americans had been caught completely unprepared. Japanese casualties were minimal. Admiral Yamamoto's bold plan had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But strategically, the attack contained crucial failures that would become apparent in coming months. The American carriers had escaped. Within 6 months, those carriers would blunt Japanese expansion at the Battle of Coral Sea and shatter Japanese offensive capability at Midway. The carriers Japan failed to sink at Pearl Harbor would ultimately defeat Japan. The oil storage facilities at Pearl Harbor remained intact. The massive fuel tanks containing millions of gallons of oil would keep the Pacific Fleet operating from Hawaii. If Nagumo had authorized a third wave and destroyed these tanks, the American fleet would have been forced to withdraw to California, adding thousands of miles to every operation and delaying offensive action by months. The submarine base and repair facilities survived with minimal damage. The submarine force, though small and equipped with defective torpedoes in 1941, would eventually strangle Japan's merchant marine, cutting the empire off from the resources it needed to fight. Pearl Harbor's repair facilities would keep damaged ships in action and return sunken vessels to service. Most critically, the attack unified American public opinion. Before December 7th, the America First movement and isolationist sentiment were powerful political forces. Many Americans opposed involvement in what they saw as Europe and Asia's problems. After Pearl Harbor, those debates ended overnight. The attack, particularly its timing while diplomats were negotiating in Washington, was seen as treachery. America entered the war united and enraged. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the attack, recognized this danger immediately. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he allegedly said. Whether he used those exact words remains debated, but the sentiment matched his known concerns. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity and national character better than most Japanese leaders. The Japanese celebration of victory was genuine but short-lived. By January, American submarines were operating aggressively from Pearl Harbor. By April, the Doolittle raid demonstrated that Japan itself was vulnerable to air attack. By June, the Battle of Midway had destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the same carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. Within a year, the United States was on the offensive in Guadalcanal, beginning the long march across the Pacific. Japanese veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack would fight throughout the war, but their numbers dwindled steadily. Commander Fuchida survived the war, later converting to Christianity and becoming a missionary. He would eventually visit Pearl Harbor and meet with American survivors, seeking reconciliation. His memoir became one of the primary Japanese sources for understanding the attack. Many of the pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor died in subsequent battles. The young Zero pilots who strafed Hickam Field fell at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. The torpedo bomber crews who sank battleships perished attacking American carriers. Japan's naval aviation, the best in the world in December 1941, was systematically destroyed by attrition it couldn't replace. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4-7, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, would prove that the December 7th attack had been a strategic failure despite its tactical success. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all veterans of Pearl Harbor, were sunk by American carrier aircraft in a single day. The Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship at Pearl Harbor, was struck by bombs from USS Enterprise dive bombers. Fires spread to the hangar deck where armed and fueled aircraft were preparing to launch. Secondary explosions tore the carrier apart. She was scuttled the next morning. The Kaga, struck by 4 bombs in rapid succession, exploded and sank within hours. The Soryu, hit by 3 bombs, burned uncontrollably, and sank that evening. The Hiryu, damaged by bombs from USS Yorktown aircraft, was scuttled after fires made her unsalvageable. In one day, Japan lost 4 carriers, their air groups, and most of their experienced maintenance crews. The loss was irreplaceable. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't build carriers fast enough to replace losses. More critically, Japan couldn't train pilots and maintenance crews fast enough to maintain the quality that had made their naval aviation dominant. Several Pearl Harbor veterans participated in sinking the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Richard Best, flying from the Enterprise, personally hit the Akagi with a bomb that started the fatal fires. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, also from the Enterprise, led the dive bomber group that found and attacked the Japanese carriers. Pilots who had watched helplessly as Pearl Harbor burned now had their revenge. The Battle of Midway was won by the carriers that escaped Pearl Harbor, by pilots trained after December 7th, and by code breakers who had learned from intelligence failures. Everything that went wrong at Pearl Harbor went right at Midway. American forces achieved surprise, concentrated overwhelming force at the decisive moment, and executed with precision. The Japanese were caught unprepared, their carriers rearming aircraft and unable to launch when American dive bombers struck. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding Japanese forces at Midway, recognized immediately that Japan had lost the war. The carriers sunk at Midway represented Japan's offensive capability. Without them, Japan could only defend its conquests, not expand. And defense meant slow defeat against American industrial superiority. The war that began at Pearl Harbor lasted nearly 4 years. American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, each step bringing them closer to Japan. The battleships raised from Pearl Harbor's mud participated in this advance, their guns bombarding enemy positions from the Aleutians to Okinawa. The USS West Virginia, sunk at Pearl Harbor, was extensively modernized after being raised. At the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, she and 5 other Pearl Harbor veterans, the Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, exacted revenge. These battleships formed the battle line that destroyed a Japanese force attempting to disrupt the Philippines invasion. The West Virginia's radar-directed guns struck the Japanese battleship Yamashiro from over 22,000 yards, helping sink her. It was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. The Nevada, beached at Pearl Harbor and nearly lost, supported the D-Day landings at Normandy in June 1944, providing naval gunfire that helped Allied forces secure the beaches. She then returned to the Pacific, bombarding Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The battleship that had tried to escape Pearl Harbor under fire ended the war, having served in both Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Individual survivors of Pearl Harbor fought throughout the war. Doris Miller, awarded the Navy Cross for his heroism, was killed in November 1943 when the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay was torpedoed and sunk during the Gilbert Islands campaign. He was 24 years old. The Navy would later name a destroyer escort and an aircraft carrier in his honor. Admiral Husband Kimmel, relieved of command after Pearl Harbor, spent the war years fighting to clear his name. He argued until his death in 1968 that he had been made a scapegoat for Washington's failures. Multiple investigations reached conflicting conclusions about responsibility. The debate continues among historians. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who replaced Kimmel as Pacific Fleet commander, turned American forces into an offensive juggernaut. Under his command, the Pacific Fleet grew from the devastated remnants of December 7th to the most powerful naval force ever assembled. By war's end, the United States had more carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers than all other nations combined. 50 years after the attack, Pearl Harbor survivors gathered for the 50th anniversary commemoration. They were elderly men now in their late 60s and 70s, but they remembered that Sunday morning with perfect clarity. Every survivor could tell you exactly where they were when the attack began, what they saw, what they felt. The USS Arizona Memorial, built above the sunken battleship in 1962, served as the focal point for remembrance. Over 1 million people visited annually, paying respects to the 1,177 men still entombed below. Oil still leaked from the Arizona's fuel tanks, creating a rainbow sheen on the water, tears from the ship, as some called it. Japanese veterans of the attack also attended, a controversial decision that generated heated debate. Former enemies met, shook hands, and attempted reconciliation. Some American survivors refused to participate in any ceremony involving Japanese veterans. The wounds were too deep, the memories too painful. Others embraced reconciliation, recognizing that the young pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor were following orders, just as American pilots followed orders throughout the war. Commander Fuchida, who led the attack, had died in 1976, but other Japanese participants remained. They expressed remorse for the attack while maintaining they were serving their country. American survivors acknowledged the courage Japanese pilots displayed while condemning the attack's treachery. These conversations were difficult, emotional, and ultimately necessary for both sides. President George H.W. Bush, a World War II Navy pilot himself, spoke at the commemoration. December 7th was a day that changed America and Americans forever. We learned that distance and oceans are no defense against aggression. We learned that evil exists in the world and must be confronted. We learned that freedom requires eternal vigilance and sometimes terrible sacrifice. The men who died here gave us those lessons. We honor them by never forgetting. Pearl Harbor transformed American military strategy, intelligence gathering, and national consciousness. The lessons learned that terrible morning shaped American defense policy for generations. The concept of strategic surprise was revolutionized. Never again would American forces assume geographic distance provided security. Forward bases, early warning systems, and intelligence networks were expanded globally. The idea that enemies would provide warning before attacking was abandoned. Readiness became constant, not something activated when war seemed imminent. Intelligence gathering and analysis were completely reorganized. The Army and Navy's separate intelligence services, which failed to share information adequately before Pearl Harbor, were eventually unified. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947, reflected lessons learned about the need for centralized intelligence analysis. The National Security Agency's focus on signals intelligence traced directly to recognition that breaking enemy codes provided crucial strategic advantage. The concept of unified command emerged from Pearl Harbor's failures. The Army and Navy's separate command structures in Hawaii had hindered coordination and response. After Pearl Harbor, unified commands were established in each theater, with one commander responsible for all forces regardless of service branch. The attack validated air power and naval aviation specifically. Battleships, the measure of naval power since the 1890s, had been shown vulnerable to air attack. Carriers, which escaped Pearl Harbor, became the new capital ships. The transformation of naval warfare from battleship-centered to carrier-centered operations began that Sunday morning. The Japanese concept of a decisive battle, one overwhelming blow that would force enemy capitulation, was proven flawed. Pearl Harbor was decisive tactically, but failed strategically. The United States didn't surrender or even consider negotiation. Instead, American resolve hardened. The attack demonstrated that modern industrial wars are won by production capacity, not individual battles. For American national consciousness, Pearl Harbor became the defining moment of the 20th century until September 11, 2001. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that sustained American war effort through 4 years of brutal combat. The attack transformed America from an isolationist nation reluctant to involve itself in foreign conflicts to a global power accepting responsibility for international security. The date itself, December 7th, remains sacred in American memory. Even generations born decades after the attack recognize its significance. Annual commemorations continue at Pearl Harbor and across America. Each year, fewer survivors attend as age claims those who lived through that morning. Soon, all will be gone, and Pearl Harbor will transition from living memory to history. The final accounting of Pearl Harbor's cost took years to complete. The human casualties were clear: 2,003 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded. But the material losses required extensive analysis. Of the 8 battleships present, 2, the Arizona and Oklahoma, were total losses. The Arizona remains where she sank. The Oklahoma was raised, stripped for parts, and eventually lost while under tow to scrappers. 3 battleships, West Virginia, California, and Nevada, were sunk but later raised, repaired, and returned to service. 3 battleships, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, were damaged but repaired relatively quickly. 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary vessels were sunk or damaged. All but the Arizona and Oklahoma were eventually returned to service. The salvage operation at Pearl Harbor recovered and repaired ships that represented years of construction time and millions of dollars in investment. Aircraft losses were severe: 188 destroyed, 159 damaged. The destroyed aircraft represented approximately 40% of Army and Navy air power in Hawaii. But aircraft were replaceable. By mid-1942, American aircraft production exceeded 4,000 planes monthly, rendering Pearl Harbor's aircraft losses insignificant in the larger context. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 64 men killed. Measured against the destruction inflicted, these losses were trivial, but measured against strategic outcomes, they were catastrophic. The attack provoked war with an industrial power capable of producing more war material than Japan could ever hope to match. By war's end, Japan had lost virtually its entire navy, including all 10 battleships present in 1941, all fleet carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, and over 300,000 naval personnel killed. The entire merchant marine that sustained Japan's empire was destroyed by American submarines operating from Pearl Harbor. Japan's cities were burned by B-29s, its industry shattered, its military defeated, and ultimately 2 cities obliterated by atomic weapons. The calculation was brutal but clear. Pearl Harbor was a tactical success that triggered strategic catastrophe. Admiral Yamamoto had feared awakening a sleeping giant. His fears proved justified. The America that emerged from World War II was a superpower, dominant economically, militarily, and politically. Japan emerged occupied, defeated, and completely transformed.